What would you do if, in the moment of signing the most important deal of your life, a quiet voice whispered, "Don't sign, it's a trap"? Richard Coleman, a self-made millionaire and respected CEO, was seconds away from sealing a merger worth billions when his shy secretary, Emily Harper, leaned close and uttered those fateful words. A woman dismissed by most as invisible suddenly became the only barrier between Richard and disaster. But could he believe her? Should he trust Emily, the young woman, who seemed to have nothing to gain and everything to lose, or Thomas Green, his best friend of 30 years and partner in building the company? The choice would ignite a storm of betrayal, humiliation, and courage. Richard would be forced to confront not only treachery in the boardroom, but also the ghosts of his past, and discover whether integrity can truly survive in a world driven by greed. Stay with us, because what unfolds next will shock you and remind you that sometimes the quietest voices carry the greatest truths. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories so you never miss an inspiring tale like this one. Now, let's begin. Richard Coleman had built his fortune the way a craftsman builds a cathedral, not in a rush of shortcuts, but brick by brick, with patience, diligence, and a sense of pride in doing things right. At 58, Richard was known in Boston's financial district as the kind of man who could stare down a market crash and still walk away. Standing, his company, Coleman Systems, had weathered recessions, technological upheavals, and fierce competitors. Through it all, Richard remained steady calm, measured, and strong-willed. But on this particular morning, as he sat at the head of the gleaming mahogany table in the 25th floor boardroom, he felt an unfamiliar weight pressing on his chest. Today was supposed to be triumphant. Today, he would sign the contract that would merge his company with Northbridge Holdings, a global powerhouse. The papers had been prepared, the champagne was chilling, cameras were waiting outside for a press statement that would announce the biggest deal of his career. Billions of dollars, the promise of international expansion, legacy secured. That was what everyone around him believed. The boardroom itself looked as though it had been staged for a photograph in a business magazine. Dark suits and polished shoes gleamed under recessed lighting. Tall windows framed a view of the Charles River glinting in the late morning sun. His old friend and chief financial officer, Thomas Green, sat close by, his silver hair combed neatly, his smile fixed with practiced confidence. Richard straightened his tie, felt the pen between his fingers, and leaned toward the contract. It was in that suspended moment just inches from the page that the door eased open. A young woman entered quietly, carrying a slim folder against her chest. She moved with the soft caution of someone accustomed to not drawing attention. Her blonde hair was tied back, her gray suit plain, her steps measured. "Excuse me," she said, her voice low, careful. "I'll just place these updated schedules here." The executives barely glanced at her. To them, she was invisible, just a secretary doing her job. But Richard noticed her hands trembled slightly as she set down the folder near his elbow. She didn't leave right away. Instead, she leaned just close enough that her words brushed against his ear. "Don't sign," she whispered. "It's a trap." The pen slipped from Richard's hand. The words were so quiet, so fleeting. He almost wondered if he had imagined them. But when he turned his head, the young woman was already stepping back, her eyes lowered, her face composed as though she had said nothing unusual at all. A dozen thoughts fired through his mind at once. Trap. What trap? Who was this woman to warn him, and why now? At the very brink of a deal that had taken 2 years to negotiate, the room seemed to shrink around him. Every tick of the clock sounded louder than it should. Richard Thomas's voice broke through, smooth and encouraging. "Are you ready to sign? Everyone's waiting." Richard's throat felt dry. He glanced at the contract, then at Thomas, and then back toward the door where the secretary had vanished as silently as she had come. For a moment, he considered dismissing the whisper as nerves. After all, he had weathered countless deals before. But there was something in her tone urgent, earnest, almost desperate that unsettled him. His hand hovered over the pen again. then stopped. "I'll need a few minutes," Richard said abruptly, his baritone steady but edged with something new. Thomas blinked, caught off guard. "A few minutes, Richard. The terms are finalized. We've been through every detail." "I said a few minutes." Richard rose from his chair, buttoning his jacket with deliberate calm. The other executives exchanged confused glances. Northbridge's representatives shifted impatiently, but Richard didn't offer further explanation. He stepped out of the boardroom, closing the door firmly behind him. The hallway outside was quiet, lined with framed photographs of the company's milestones. Richard's polished shoes echoed against the marble floor as he scanned for the secretary. He spotted her halfway down the corridor, clutching her folder tightly, her stride brisk as though she hoped to escape notice. Miss Richard called, his voice carrying the authority of decades in command. She froze, shoulders tensing. Slowly, she turned, her expression calm but wary. "Walk with me," Richard said. For a second she hesitated, then, as though deciding she had no choice, she nodded. They entered a small conference room down the hall. Richard closed the door, the soft click sealing them in. He faced her squarely, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with intense focus. "Explain," he said simply. The young woman drew a breath, her fingers tightening on the folder. "I know how it sounds. Mr. Coleman," she began, her voice steady but hushed. "But if you sign that contract, you won't be gaining a partner. You'll be handing them everything." Richard studied her, every instinct in him demanding proof. Clarity. "You have 30 seconds to convince me you're not imagining shadows," he said. Her eyes lifted to his, clear and determined. "I overheard conversations. I've seen documents. This merger isn't what it appears to be. Please just don't sign yet. Give yourself time to see what's really happening." For a long, taut moment, neither spoke. Richard could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning, the muted noise of traffic far below. His mind raced between skepticism and the unsettling weight of her conviction. Finally, Richard exhaled slowly. "What's your name?" "Emily Harper," she replied. Richard repeated it under his breath, as if testing the weight of the syllables. Emily Harper, a name he had never noticed before in all his years at the helm. He nodded once, his jaw tightening. "All right, Miss Turner, you've bought yourself time. But if you're wrong, if this is some misunderstanding or attempt at drama, you'll regret speaking those words." Emily didn't flinch. "I understand." Richard turned toward the window, gazing out at the sunlit river, his reflection staring back at him in the glass. Something inside him shifted. He had come within inches of signing away his life's work. And now, because of a whisper, doubt had entered the room. He didn't know yet whether Emily Harper had saved him or deceived him, but one thing was certain: his world would not be the same after this day. The boardroom door closed behind Richard with a soft thud, leaving a wake of murmurs and impatient sighs. Inside, the tension had begun to coil like a spring. Executives shifted in their seats, puzzled. Northbridge's lawyers glanced at their watches, brows furrowed. This was supposed to be the smooth conclusion of months of work, no room for hesitation. And then there was Thomas Green. Thomas leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, his silver hair catching the light. He gave the room a smile meant to reassure, but the corners of his mouth quivered just enough to betray irritation. "Richard just needs a moment," he told the others, his voice smooth, confident, the voice of a man who had stood beside Richard for 3 decades. He's always been deliberate. It's one of the reasons Coleman Systems has thrived. Still. His eyes flicked toward the door with a sharpness that unsettled even his closest associates. In the hallway, Richard's polished shoes clicked against the marble floor as he strode after Emily Harper. She had stopped a few steps away, clutching her folder to her chest as if it were armor. "Miss Turner," Richard said firmly, motioning toward a side office. "Inside, now." Emily obeyed, her shoulders tense. The office was modest, with a round table and a window that overlooked the river. Richard closed the door behind them, then turned with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to having every answer. "Talk," he said. Emily's fingers fidgeted with the folder, but her voice did not waver. "Mr. Coleman, I know how this looks. I know I'm only a secretary, and to most people my word doesn't carry weight, but I overheard conversations late nights, when I was filing reports. I've seen enough to know this merger isn't what it appears to be." Richard studied her. He had faced senators, Wall Street sharks, and ruthless competitors. Rarely did he find himself uncertain. Yet standing before this young woman with steady eyes, he felt his certainty slipping. What conversations he pressed. Emily drew a careful breath. Between Mr. Green and Northbridge's attorneys, not informal meetings, private talks, the kind where people lower their voices and close the blinds. They spoke about debts, massive ones, that Northbridge intends to offload onto Coleman systems. Once you sign, they'll bleed this company dry while you carry the liability. You'll lose control. Everything you've built, gone. Her words landed like stones in Richard's stomach. He narrowed his eyes. "You're accusing Thomas Green, my partner of 30 years, of conspiring against me. Against this company?" Emily didn't flinch. "Yes, sir." The silence that followed was heavy. Outside the window, a sailboat drifted lazily across the river, oblivious to the storm brewing in that small office. Richard's mind churned. Thomas had been with him since the early days, when Coleman Systems was just 2 men and a rented office above a bakery. They had weathered recessions together, celebrated victories, buried loved ones. Richard had trusted Thomas with his finances, his strategies, his secrets. And now this young woman, this secretary whose name he'd barely known until 10 minutes ago, was asking him to believe that the man closest to him was betraying him. It was absurd, and yet Richard's memory tugged at him. The sharp way Thomas had pressed for urgency in recent weeks, the unexplained late-night meetings, the new luxury car he had purchased, though Thomas had always been modest with money. Small things Richard had brushed aside at the time, now resurfaced with unsettling clarity. He turned away, pressing a hand against the window pane. The glass was cool under his palm, but his thoughts burned. If Emily was wrong, then she was meddling in affairs far beyond her station. But if she was right, if she was telling the truth, then Richard stood on the brink of disaster. Emily's voice broke the silence. "I don't expect you to take my word alone. I know how it sounds. But please, don't sign that contract today. Give yourself a chance to look closer. That's all I'm asking." Richard faced her again, his eyes dark, his jaw set. "And why would you risk your job, your livelihood for this? You understand if you're wrong, if this is some half-heard rumor, your career here is over." Emily met his gaze steadily. "Because I couldn't live with myself if I stayed quiet and watched you lose everything. Some things are worth risking for. Mr. Coleman, this is one of them." Her words carried no self-interest, no calculation, just a quiet conviction that lodged itself in Richard's chest. He drew a long breath, the kind a man takes before a plunge. "I need to think," he said at last, his tone measured, guarded. "Not a word of this leaves this room. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Emily replied softly. Richard opened the door and stepped back into the corridor. From the boardroom, muffled voices spilled out Thomas's among them, smooth and persuasive. Richard's gaze lingered on that door, the barrier between loyalty and betrayal, between trust and suspicion. For 30 years, Thomas Green had been his ally, his brother in arms. Could it all have been a facade? And for 30 seconds, Emily Harper had been a stranger, yet her warning carried the ring of truth in a way Richard could not ignore. The weight of that choice pressed down on him, as heavily as the city skyline outside. Trust the friend of 3 decades, or trust the whisper of a secretary who had nothing to gain and everything to lose. Richard straightened his shoulders and walked back toward the boardroom, the shadow of doubt trailing him like a second skin. Nothing would ever feel certain again. Richard had not returned to the boardroom right away. Instead, He found himself lingering in the small side office with Emily Harper still standing before him. He should have dismissed her, should have sent her back to her desk with a warning not to meddle in matters beyond her reach. Yet, something in her composure kept him rooted there. The woman hadn't begged, hadn't wept, hadn't even tried to shield herself from the consequences of her words. She had simply told him the truth as she understood it, steady and unshaken. Richard folded his arms. "You said you overheard conversations. You said you saw documents. Why should I believe you?" Emily hesitated, the folder still clutched tightly in her hands. Then, as though realizing there was no other way to earn his trust, she let the silence stretch before speaking. "Because, Mr. Coleman, I wasn't always a secretary." Richard tilted his head, studying her more carefully. "Go on." Emily drew a breath. Her voice softened, but it carried the weight of years she had kept locked away. "I was a student at Yale, law school, top of my class. I dreamed of practicing corporate law, of standing in courtrooms and negotiating contracts that could change companies' futures." She gave a faint, humorless laugh. "I guess, in a strange way, I got close to that. Just not how I expected." Richard's brows furrowed. The young woman who fetched coffee and scheduled his meetings. Yale law. It seemed almost absurd. "What happened?" he asked. Emily looked down at her hands, her voice steadier now that the dam had broken. "My father got sick, congestive heart failure. The treatments were expensive, and his insurance didn't cover half of what he needed. I tried to keep up with classes and take care of him, but eventually the hospital bills swallowed everything. I left law school 2 semesters before graduation." Richard remained silent, his chest tightening. "I needed a job that offered health insurance from day one." Emily continued. "Not an internship, not a fellowship that paid in prestige. Something practical, something that meant my father could get the medication and checkups that kept him alive. That's how I ended up here. A secretary's pay isn't much, but the benefits mean I can keep him going a little longer." She lifted her chin then, meeting Richard's gaze directly for the first time since she'd walked into that boardroom. "So, no, sir, I'm not doing this for attention. I'm not doing it to climb some corporate ladder. I already gave up the ladder. I'm doing it because I know what a contract should look like, and I know when one has been twisted into a weapon." The office fell into a thick silence. Richard turned slightly, staring out the window toward the river once more. The sun caught on the ripples, dazzling in its reflection, but he barely noticed. His mind lingered instead on the picture Emily had painted, a brilliant student, forced to lay down her ambitions so she could shoulder the burden of a sick parent. He thought of his own father, long gone now, a man who had worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, who had believed in honesty as though it were scripture. Richard could almost hear his father's voice in the back of his mind. The worth of a person isn't measured by what they do, but by what they endure for others. He rubbed a hand over his jaw. This was not the profile of a liar or of a schemer hoping to trick him for personal gain. Emily Harper had nothing to win here except the faint hope that he might believe her. Richard turned back to her. His voice was lower now, almost reflective. "You walked away from Yale, from the career you wanted, all because of your father." Emily gave a small nod. "Some choices don't feel like choices. Mr. Coleman, family comes first. Always." Richard studied her face, searching for cracks, for signs of exaggeration, but all he saw was quiet conviction. He sank into a chair, leaning his elbows on the table, fingers interlaced. "You know," he said slowly, "most people in this building probably don't even know your name. You're just the voice that answers phones, the hands that print itineraries. But you're standing here telling me that the very contract I'm about to sign will end my company. Why?" Emily did not look away. "Because you treat people differently. I've watched you. You shake the janitor's hand. You ask the receptionist about her kids. You don't look through us the way most executives do. That's why I couldn't stand by and let them ruin you the way they've ruined others." The words landed with a weight Richard hadn't expected. He was a man accustomed to being respected, even feared in his industry. But rarely had anyone suggested he was noticed for something as simple as kindness. He sat back, inhaling deeply, torn between the trust he had given Thomas Green for 30 years and the raw honesty shining from this young woman he had overlooked for 3. "Miss Turner," he said finally, his voice rougher than he intended. "You realize what you've done today could cost you everything. If Thomas learns you've been eavesdropping, if he suspects you've interfered, he'll see to it you never work in this city again." Emily's grip on the folder tightened. "I know, but some risks are worth taking." Richard closed his eyes for a brief moment. His mind replayed the morning Thomas urging him to hurry, the ink of the pen poised over the contract, Emily's whisper breaking through the noise. "She has nothing to gain by lying. So, why am I still hesitating?" When he opened his eyes again, they were fixed on her with a sharper focus than before. "All right," he said. "You've given me reason to pause, but I will need more than whispers and intuition. If what you say is true, I'll need proof, hard proof. Can you provide that?" Emily swallowed, then nodded. "Yes, but it won't be easy." Richard leaned forward, resting his clasped hands on the table. "Then bring it to me, tonight. And if you're right, you may have just saved more than my company." For the first time that morning, a flicker of relief crossed Emily's face. She inclined her head respectfully, then turned toward the door. When she left, Richard remained in the quiet office, the weight of the choice pressing heavier than ever. He looked down at his empty hand where the pen had rested just moments ago, ready to seal his fate now, thanks to a secretary with a past she had never intended to reveal. His path had diverged into shadows. Richard Coleman returned to the boardroom with the steadiness of a man who had commanded rooms like this for decades. His posture was composed, his voice calm, but beneath the surface his mind was no longer steady. Thomas Green was already on his feet, greeting him with a reassuring smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "There you are. I was beginning to worry. Ready to put ink to paper." Richard nodded faintly and reclaimed his seat. The contract still lay before him, a neat stack of papers waiting for his signature. He lifted the pen, then set it down again. "Let's review 1 or 2 clauses once more," he said, his tone neutral. "I'd like a clean night's sleep before finalizing this." The room stirred with murmurs. The Northbridge attorneys exchanged glances, clearly annoyed. Thomas's smile tightened, but he kept his voice even. "Of course, Richard, but we've been through every line a dozen times. Another look won't hurt," Richard replied. His words carried the firmness of command, closing the discussion. That evening, Richard sat alone in his office, the city lights of Boston shimmering beyond the tall windows. The contract folder rested on his desk, unopened. He poured himself a glass of bourbon, the amber liquid catching the glow of the desk lamp, and leaned back in his chair. He thought of Thomas. 30 years. 30 years of friendship, of late nights building Coleman systems from a tiny office with secondhand furniture. They had shared ramen noodles in their 20s when money was scarce, celebrated deals with cheap champagne, and toasted promotions with fine wine. Thomas had been the best man at Richard's wedding. He had carried Richard through grief when his wife passed away. He had held Richard's newborn son and whispered promises to be a second father if anything ever happened. And now, because of a whisper from a secretary, Richard was questioning whether all of it had been real. He took a slow sip of bourbon, closing his eyes. Memories flickered like old film reels. The first time Thomas had suggested they take on risky debt, Richard had dismissed it as ambition. The quiet lunches Thomas often had with competitors, claiming he was keeping enemies close. The new summer home in Nantucket, purchased in cash. Though Thomas's salary couldn't have stretched that far, they were puzzle pieces Richard had never bothered to connect. But now, with Emily's warning echoing in his ears, they assembled into a picture he didn't want to see. The following morning, Emily appeared at his office door promptly at 7. She carried a small flash drive in one hand, her expression serious. "I found it," she said simply. Richard gestured for her to come in. She plugged the drive into his computer and opened two documents side by side. This, she pointed to the first file, is the version of the contract you were given, and this, she clicked to the second, is the actual version drafted by Northbridge, the one they intend to swap in at the signing. Richard leaned forward, scanning the pages. At first glance they appeared identical, but Emily highlighted the differences, clauses buried deep in the text, language adjusted by just a few words, and those words shifted control of the company's assets, transferring liability for Northbridge's debts squarely onto Coleman's systems. He felt his stomach knot as he read line after line. "This isn't just manipulation," he muttered. "It's fraud." Emily nodded grimly. "If you had signed yesterday, within weeks you'd have been forced to sell off divisions just to cover their losses. In 6 months, Coleman Systems would be nothing but a shell." Richard pushed back from the desk, running a hand through his graying hair. His heart thudded with anger and dread. "And Thomas knew," he said quietly. Emily hesitated. "The conversations I overheard weren't vague. Mr. Coleman, he's in this with them. He's been their inside man." Richard turned away, gripping the edge of the window frame as he stared down at the city below. The streets were already alive with traffic, ordinary people hurrying to their jobs, unaware that in this office a man's world was tilting off its axis. "If this is true," he thought, "I haven't just been blind. I've been a fool." His reflection in the glass looked back at him, strong jaw, tired eyes, a man who had fought his way to the top. And yet, beneath that image, another voice whispered, "What kind of leader doesn't see betrayal in his own house?" Emily broke the silence. "I know it's hard to accept. He's been your partner a long time." Richard turned slowly, his face drawn, his voice low. "Longer than you've been alive." Her gaze softened, but she didn't waver. "That doesn't mean he can't betray you." Richard sank into his chair, elbows on the desk, head in his hands. He felt the weight of 30 years pressing down, friendship, loyalty, shared victories, laughter, grief. If Thomas truly had conspired against him, it wasn't just a business betrayal. It was personal, the kind that cracks not only companies, but souls. Late that night, Richard sat again in his office long after the staff had gone home. Emily's evidence still glowed on the screen. He hadn't told her, but she was right. He couldn't ignore it any longer. His bourbon glass sat untouched this time. His mind was too sharp, too restless. If this is true, I could lose my company. But if it isn't, I could lose my only true friend. It was a choice with no clean outcome. Trust would either be shattered by betrayal or by suspicion. And for the first time in years, Richard Coleman felt like a man standing on shifting sand. The next morning, the boardroom was thick with anticipation. The long mahogany table gleamed under recessed lighting, contracts stacked neatly at each seat, coffee steamed in porcelain cups, untouched as the executives shifted with restless energy. Thomas Green sat at Richard's right hand, a practiced smile plastered on his face. "Richard, the market is watching. Every hour we delay puts us at risk. Northbridge is ready. All we need is your signature." Across the table, Northbridge's lead negotiator, a sharp-eyed man named Harold Stanton, leaned forward. "He's right. Timing is everything. Competitors are circling. If we don't move today, tomorrow may be too late." Richard clasped his hands together, his jaw tight. He had spent the night staring at Emily's evidence, the twin contracts with their sinister differences, and his certainty had shattered. Signing now would mean gambling everything he had built. He cleared his throat. "I appreciate your urgency, but I want another 24 hours, just to review one last time." The room froze. Thomas's smile faltered. "Richard," he said carefully, "we've reviewed this contract line by line. Your lawyers, our auditors, everyone has cleared it." "Then another day won't hurt," Richard replied, his voice calm but unyielding. Stanton's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Coleman, hesitation in business is weakness. The market smells weakness like blood. Are you prepared to see Coleman Systems stock tumble because you couldn't decide? Richard leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. I've led this company for 30 years. One more day won't sink it. Thomas's hand curled into a fist beneath the table, but outwardly he kept his voice level. Very well, he said, though his tone betrayed strain. But tomorrow, Richard, no more delays. That evening, Emily moved silently through the quiet executive floor. Most of the staff had gone home, leaving only the faint hum of the cleaning crew's vacuum and the glow of security lights. She wore a navy cardigan and kept her heels in her hand to muffle her steps. Her pulse pounded as she slipped into Thomas Green's office. It was immaculate, almost sterile framed diplomas, tidy stacks of financial reports, a family photo of Thomas and his wife smiling on a beach. But Emily wasn't here for the surface. She went to the mahogany desk and opened the drawers. The top one held pens aligned neatly, business cards in a silver case. Nothing unusual. The second drawer revealed folders. She flipped through them, quickly expense reports, vendor contracts until one file caught her eye. Inside were printed copies of emails. Subject lines leapt out at her: transfer terms, revised clauses, debt liability. Her breath quickened. She took photos with her phone, careful to replace each page exactly as she found it. Then she noticed a thin manila folder at the back of the drawer. She slid it out, her hands trembling. Inside were two versions of the same contract, one nearly identical to the one Richard had, the other riddled with changes that stripped him of control. The differences weren't just subtle, they were damning. In one version, Coleman Systems retained 65% ownership after the merger. In the other, Richard would hold less than 20. Emily snapped photos of each page, her fingers barely steady enough to press the shutter. Suddenly, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Emily's heart lurched. She slipped the folder back, closed the drawer, and ducked behind a cabinet just as the office door handle rattled. Thomas stepped inside. He muttered to himself, loosening his tie, his back to her. He pulled a bottle of scotch from the cabinet and poured a glass. For a moment, he simply stood there, staring out the window at the city skyline. "Stubborn old fool," he murmured. "He has no idea what's coming." Emily's pulse thundered in her ears. She pressed herself tighter against the cabinet, willing herself invisible. After a long moment, Thomas drained his glass, set it down, and left, the door clicking shut behind him. Emily exhaled shakily. She waited 30 seconds, then crept out, her legs trembling. She slipped from the office, shoes still in her hand, and padded quickly down the corridor toward the stairwell. By the time she reached the street, her phone was heavy with photos evidence that could destroy Thomas Green. Meanwhile, Richard sat in his study at home, the fire crackling in the hearth, though he hardly felt its warmth. He stared at a framed photograph of himself and Thomas, taken 25 years ago at the opening of their first office. Both men had been younger, smiling with the unshakable optimism of men who believe friendship could outlast anything. He lifted the photograph, studying it with weary eyes. How many signs did I miss the new house in Nantucket? The insistence on rushing the merger, the faint condescension when Richard hesitated. Trust had blinded him. If Emily is right, he thought, then Thomas has betrayed not only me, but the very company we built from nothing. And if she's wrong, then I am about to throw away the only friendship that ever truly anchored me. The bourbon glass sat untouched on the table. His hands were too unsteady for it. Later that night, Emily met Richard in his office. She handed him her phone. The photos pulled up on screen. "Here," she said, her voice low. "Emails, scanned contracts, 2 versions. They've been planning to swap them at the last minute." Richard scrolled slowly, his face hardening with each image. By the 5th page, his hand was clenched so tightly around the phone that his knuckles whitened. "They were going to strip me of everything," he whispered. Emily nodded, "and leave you carrying Northbridge's debts. You'd be bankrupt within a year." Richard set the phone down on the desk, his eyes dark and distant. "If this is true," he thought, "I stand to lose not only the company, but the very foundation of trust I built my life upon. The weight of betrayal pressed heavy on his chest, making it hard to breathe. For the first time in his career, Richard Coleman, the man who always had an answer, who always knew the next move, felt cornered. The trap had been set, and now it was tightening. The following afternoon, Richard arrived at the Coleman Systems headquarters to find a strange tension in the air. Employees whispered in the hallways, glancing nervously toward the auditorium. An email had gone out earlier, stamped urgent mandatory company-wide meeting. 3:00 p.m. Attendance required. Richard hadn't called any such meeting. His stomach sank. When he entered the cavernous auditorium, the seats were already filling. Engineers, assistants, accountants, and senior managers murmured among themselves. The stage was lit, a podium at its center. Thomas Green stood there, calm and commanding, as though he were a general addressing troops before battle. Richard took a seat in the front row, still unsure of what was about to unfold. Thomas adjusted the microphone. His voice carried clearly across the hushed room. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. What I'm about to say is not easy, but transparency is the lifeblood of trust. And as custodians of this great company, we must confront hard truths head on." The crowd shifted uneasily. Thomas's gaze swept the room before narrowing with calculated gravity. "Yesterday, we uncovered a breach of security. Confidential merger documents were photographed and tampered with. False rumors have been spread, rumors designed to derail a deal that could secure our company's future." A ripple of shock traveled through the auditorium. Richard's throat went dry. He gripped the arms of his chair, a dawning horror prickling through him. Thomas's voice hardened. "The source of this breach has been identified. A member of our own staff, someone who abused access, violated trust, and endangered everything we've worked for." Murmurs broke out. Heads turned, searching. Then Thomas spoke the name, Emily Harper. Gasps filled the room. Emily sat frozen near the back, her hands clutching her lap. Her face drained of color as every eye landed on her. She entered executive offices without authorization. Thomas continued, holding up a folder. Security footage places her there, and here he pulled out printed images or the documents found on her personal device. Sensitive contracts, photographed without permission. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is corporate espionage." Emily's voice broke through, trembling but resolute. "That's not true." She rose from her seat. "I wasn't stealing. I was trying to protect Mr. Coleman, protect all of you." "Enough," Thomas snapped, his voice booming through the speakers. "Protect. By spreading lies about me and our partners at Northbridge. Lies that could tank our stock and cost every one of you your jobs." The room buzzed with confusion and judgment. Some employees shook their heads in dismay. Others avoided her gaze. Emily's eyes darted to Richard in the front row. Her silent plea was unmistakable. "Say something? Tell them I'm not lying." But Richard sat frozen, caught between shock and fear. His mouth opened, then closed again. He could hear his pulse pounding in his ears, could feel the eyes of the entire company upon him. Thomas pressed on. "In light of these actions, Ms. Turner's employment is hereby terminated, effective immediately. Security." 2 guards moved toward her. Emily's chin trembled, but she straightened her shoulders. "This is wrong," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "You all know me. I worked late nights, weekends. I cared about this company. I never would have done what he's accusing me of. I found the truth, and now he's burying me for it." The guards flanked her, urging her toward the aisle. She turned one last time, her eyes locking on Richard. "Mr. Coleman, you know I'm telling the truth." Her voice cracked. "Please." Every muscle in Richard's body screamed to stand, to defend her, to call out Thomas's performance for the charade it was. But fear paralyzed him, the fear of making an accusation without undeniable proof, the fear of detonating the company in front of hundreds of employees. He remained seated, silent. Emily's face crumpled, but she did not break. "Then remember this moment," she said, her voice raw but strong. Remember that you let the only person brave enough to speak the truth be dragged through the mud. The guards led her down the aisle. Employees whispered and stared, some with pity, others with suspicion. A few looked away, unable to watch. By the time she reached the door, Emily's eyes were glassy with unshed tears. She disappeared through it with her head held high. The room settled into uneasy silence. Thomas exhaled heavily, as though the burden of leadership weighed upon him. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the price of disloyalty. But rest assured, Coleman Systems will not falter. The merger with Northbridge remains on track, and our future is secure. Scattered applause rose, hesitant but obedient. Richard sat rigid, the words echoing around him like shards of glass. I stayed silent, he thought, shame pressing hard against his chest. I let her take the fall. For the rest of the meeting, he heard nothing. The speeches, the reassurances, the hollow promises all blurred into meaningless sound. His mind replayed only one image: Emily Harper being escorted out. Her dignity intact, even as her reputation was destroyed. When the auditorium finally emptied, Richard remained in his seat, staring at the stage. The pen he had almost used to sign away his company felt heavier now than any weapon. He whispered to himself, so low no one else could hear. I failed her, the one person who had the courage to tell me the truth, and I let her be buried. The fire crackled faintly in his memory of last night, the glow of the screen where Emily had shown him the evidence. The truth was in his hands, and yet, when the moment came, he had chosen silence. Silence had never felt so loud. The night after the company meeting, Boston was alive with its usual rhythm traffic along the Charles, laughter spilling from late-night bars, the hum of a city that never quite slept. But in Richard Coleman's townhouse, silence reigned. Richard sat alone in his study, a fire burning low in the hearth. He had shed his jacket hours earlier, his tie lying crumpled on the floor. A glass of bourbon sat untouched beside him, the ice long since melted into watery amber. He hadn't closed his eyes once. Every time he tried, the same image forced its way into his mind: Emily Harper, her eyes wide with desperation, her voice trembling as she called his name before the guards led her away. Mr. Coleman, you know I'm telling the truth. Please. He had sat there, silent, while Thomas destroyed her in front of the entire company. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, burying his face in his hands. Shame clawed at him. For decades, he had prided himself on his integrity, on being the kind of leader who did what was right even when it was difficult. And yet, when the moment came, he had frozen. Now, a young woman had lost her job, her reputation, perhaps her future because of his silence. The fire crackled softly, but it offered no warmth. At midnight, unable to sit still any longer, Richard rose and crossed to his desk. The merger contract lay where he had left it, the heavy binder thick with legal jargon. He pulled it open, page by page, his tired eyes scanning each clause. At first it all seemed familiar, words he had reviewed a dozen times. Yet, as he read more carefully, something tugged at his memory. Emily's voice, steady and certain, pointing out hidden traps, small words that shifted enormous power. He leaned closer. On page 42, a clause referenced Addendum C. Richard frowned. There was no Addendum C in the binder. He checked the appendix, the index, the supporting files. Nothing. His pulse quickened. On page 57, another oddity: a phrase that read, liabilities to be absorbed at discretion. It was vague, almost meaningless on its own. But in the context of a merger worth billions, such a phrase could be lethal. He slammed the binder shut, leaning back in his chair. Emily had been right. Something was off, something deliberate. He rubbed his eyes, exhaustion dragging at him, but his mind refused to rest. At 2 a.m, Richard stood at his study window, looking out over the sleeping city. The lights of Boston twinkled against the dark, reflected in the river like broken glass. Inside him, Two voices warred: sign the contract, protect the company's reputation, keep shareholders calm. Thomas is your partner, trust him. But the other voice, quieter yet more insistent, refused to fade. Emily had no reason to lie. She risked everything to warn you, and you let her be destroyed for it. Richard gripped the windowsill until his knuckles whitened. What if she's wrong? He whispered into the empty room. What if I destroy 30 years of friendship, and the company with it, for a rumor? But even as he spoke, another question burned hotter. What if she's right? The cost of being wrong was unbearable either way. He sat again at the desk, flipping open the binder once more. He read until his eyes ached, searching for anything, any trace of the deception Emily had promised him. The hours crawled. Shadows shifted as the fire dwindled to ash. By 4 o'clock, the room felt suffocating. Richard closed the binder and pressed his forehead against the cool wood of the desk. I can't unsee it anymore, he thought. The gaps, the contradictions, the lies hidden in plain sight. He remembered Thomas's face that afternoon, calm and commanding as he accused Emily of theft. How easily he had twisted the story, how readily the employees had believed him. And Richard had sat there, silent. The shame was heavy, but heavier still was the realization that silence had made him complicit. As dawn broke, pale light creeping across the Boston skyline, Richard remained awake. He had not slept, had not eaten. He had only wrestled with the same impossible choice. If he signed the contract, Coleman Systems would appear strong, decisive. The shareholders would be reassured. The press would praise his leadership. But within months, if Emily was right, everything would collapse. If he refused to sign, he risked chaos now. Northbridge would retaliate. Thomas would turn on him. The board might lose confidence. His reputation could shatter overnight. And yet, if Emily was right, refusing to sign was the only way to save the company at all. He closed his eyes, his chest tight. Do I protect the company's name by going along with the lie? Or do I risk everything to chase the truth? The clock on the mantel chimed 6. The city outside stirred awake. But Richard felt no closer to resolution. He poured the untouched bourbon into the sink, watching the amber liquid swirl down the drain. For the first time in his career, Richard Coleman had no plan, no strategy, no clear next step. Only the memory of a young woman's eyes, pleading with him to believe, and the silence that still haunted him. The morning light did nothing to ease Richard Coleman's unrest. He had showered, dressed, and walked into the office like a man on autopilot, nodding to greetings, forcing a calm that felt brittle under his skin. By mid-morning, he sat at his desk, the blinds drawn, his computer humming softly. The contract binder lay unopened beside him, but today Richard wasn't looking at paper. He needed answers, answers hidden deeper than the neat pages Thomas had placed in front of him. With steady hands, he logged into the company's secure server using his CEO credentials. He had rarely delved into these archives personally, preferring to delegate to trusted staff. But today, trust felt like a luxury he could no longer afford. He typed search terms, Addendum C, asset distribution, post-merger. At first the results came up empty, folders protected by layers of encryption. He narrowed his eyes. Whoever had hidden them hadn't expected him to look. Minutes stretched into an hour as he navigated password prompts, encryption keys, and digital dead ends. Finally, buried in a directory innocuously labeled Legal Supplements, he found it Addendum C. Richard hesitated only a second before opening it. The screen filled with columns of numbers, clauses in dense legalese, pages of tables outlining asset transfers. He scrolled faster, his heart thudding. Then he saw it. After the merger, Coleman Systems would transfer 75% of its assets not to Northbridge directly, but to a holding company registered offshore. The name blinked up at him, Halcyon International Holdings, Cayman Islands. Richard's hand went cold on the mouse. He scrolled to the bottom, scanning the shareholders' registry. 2 names stared back at him, clean and final as a gravestone inscription. Thomas Green, Evelyn Ross. The world tilted. For a moment, Richard couldn't breathe. He pushed back from his desk, the chair rolling against the wall with a hollow thud. Thomas, his friend, his brother, his confidant for 3 decades. The man who had stood beside him through everything, plotting not only to strip him of his company, but to profit from its carcass. And Evelyn. Her name alone was enough to bring a storm of memories crashing over him. Evelyn Ross, the woman who had once been the great love of his life, sharp-minded, ambitious, a rising star in corporate law when they met. She had dazzled him with her wit and boldness, had pushed him to dream bigger. They had spent 2 years together, long walks through Beacon Hill, whispered plans of a future entwined, but in the end, Evelyn had left him. Her words still cut. Decades later, you think too small. Richard, you cling to principles that will chain you down. I won't spend my life with a man afraid to chase more. He had told himself he was better off without her, that her hunger for power was a fire that would consume her. Yet here her name was, all these years later, next to Thomas's, on the very document that would ruin him. A best friend and a lost love, joined together in betrayal. Richard pressed his palms against the desk, bowing his head. His chest ached with a mixture of rage and grief so sharp it made his hands tremble. My God, I've spent my whole life trusting the wrong people. The memories came unbidden. Thomas laughing with him over cheap beers in their 20s. Evelyn brushing his cheek with her hand, promising she believed in him more than anyone. Thomas standing at his wedding, raising a toast. Evelyn walking away down a rainy street, never once looking back. It was all tangled now, blurred by the revelation that those 2 most pivotal figures in his life had conspired to take everything he had left. He rose abruptly, pacing the office like a man trapped in a cage. The city beyond his window blurred into meaningless lights. He wanted to believe it wasn't real, that perhaps this document was fabricated, that the names were inserted as some kind of error. But deep down, he knew. The precision of the language, the careful concealment, this was no mistake. Thomas Green and Evelyn Ross had written their names on his downfall. By noon, Richard found himself staring at the photo on his desk. It was of Coleman Systems' first office himself, Thomas, and a handful of scrappy employees grinning in front of a sign they had painted themselves. He picked it up, gripping it so tightly the frame creaked. 30 years, he muttered aloud. 30 years. And this is what you were waiting for. His voice cracked, raw with disbelief. Then Evelyn's face rose in his mind, her sharp smile, her cool eyes the night she had told him ambition mattered more than love. A chill ran down his spine. Of course she would align with Thomas. 2 ambitious minds, unburdened by conscience. Richard sank into his chair, the photo still clutched in his hand. His reflection in the glass stared back at him, tired, worn, older than he felt only yesterday. How many times had he been blind? How many warnings had he ignored because loyalty, or love, had made him deaf? That evening, as the office emptied and the city turned to dusk, Richard remained in the dark. Addendum. Sea glowing faintly on the screen. Every line was another knife. 75% of his company's assets funneled into a shell corporation. Control of the board transferred to Halcyon International. His own role reduced to a figurehead with no authority. He scrolled again to the bottom, forcing himself to look once more at the names. Thomas Green, Evelyn Ross. He whispered their names aloud, the sound bitter on his tongue. It wasn't just betrayal. It was desecration of friendship, of love, of every bond he had believed unbreakable. Richard leaned back, staring at the ceiling, fighting the heaviness pressing against his chest. All my life, I thought character mattered more than ambition. I built a company on that belief. I trusted people I shouldn't have. And now? Now it may cost me everything. The office was silent, but for the hum of the computer. The weight of betrayal hung heavy, thicker than the night itself. Richard closed the file at last, his decision unfinished, his heart shattered by the knowledge that the 2 people he had once trusted most had joined hands in destroying him. For the first time in decades, Richard Coleman felt utterly alone. The office was nearly silent when Richard returned the next morning. His secretary greeted him with the usual polite smile, but he barely noticed. He moved quickly, his mind already fixed on one destination. Human Resources, Martha Hayes, head of HR, looked startled when Richard appeared in her doorway. "Mr. Coleman, is something wrong?" "Not exactly," he said, his tone brisk. "I need access to an employee file. Emily Harper." Martha hesitated. "Emily, she's no longer with the company." "Sir?" "I'm aware," Richard replied, his voice softening. "All the same, please." Minutes later, Richard sat in a small conference room with a slim folder before him. He opened it with hands both eager and ashamed. The first page listed basic information: age, address, emergency contact, nothing unusual. But as he flipped through, his breath caught: Yale Law School, honors graduate, judicial clerkship, Second Circuit Court of Appeals, associate attorney, Whitman and Rowe, LLP. Richard leaned back, stunned. Emily Harper had not been some timid secretary fresh out of community college. She had once stood on the path to becoming one of the brightest legal minds in the country. Why had she ended up here, typing memos and arranging calendars? He turned another page. A handwritten note from her interview surfaced, seeking stability and health benefits due to father's long-term illness. Richard closed his eyes, the weight pressing down on him. It made sense now. She had traded ambition for duty, exchanged a gleaming future for the quiet security that her father's medical needs demanded. She had walked away from prestige to care for family, and he had let Thomas destroy her reputation in a single afternoon. Richard set the folder down and pressed his palms together, elbows braced on the table. His mind replayed that humiliating meeting the moment Thomas had accused Emily of theft, the guards escorting her out, the silence Richard himself had chosen. He remembered her face as she looked at him, eyes wide, desperate, pleading for him to speak, and he had said nothing. The memory clawed at him. Merciless. You let her fall? Richard, you knew there was something in her words, something honest, and still you chose silence, because it was easier, because you were afraid of what Thomas might say, afraid of rocking the boat you thought was steady. Now, the truth was clear, the boat had already been sinking, and she had been the only one brave enough to point it out. He rose abruptly, pacing the narrow room, the folder still lying open on the table. Emily Harper, Yale Law, honors graduate, Emily Harper, the woman who had whispered a warning in his ear when no one else dared. Emily Harper, who had lost everything because he had failed her. His reflection in the dark window looked back at him, lined, weary, older than he remembered. For decades, he had prided himself on being a leader who valued loyalty, who stood by those who stood by him. But when Emily had stood by him, he had faltered. The shame gnawed at him. Do I even have the right to ask her help? Now he wondered, after I let her be dragged out like a criminal, after I betrayed her courage with my silence, the logical answer was no. She had every reason to despise him, to turn away if he sought her again. And yet, the stakes were too high. Emily was not just another employee. She was the only person who had seen through Thomas and Evelyn, the only person who had risked herself to sound the alarm. And with her legal mind, her knowledge of contracts, she might be the only ally capable of dismantling their scheme before it was too late. Richard's fists clenched at his sides. He needed her, not just as an employee, but as the one person who had proven braver than he had. But more than that, he owed her truth, owed her vindication, owed her a defense he had failed to give when she needed it most. Richard sat back down, staring at the folder again. His thoughts churned, a storm of regret and determination. He pictured Emily sitting in her modest apartment, perhaps still reeling from the humiliation, wondering how she would find her next job, how she would explain to neighbors or friends why she was suddenly unemployed. She must hate him, but perhaps, just perhaps, there was still a chance. People can forgive when they see honesty. When they see a man willing to admit his failings, the question burned in his chest. Do I deserve a second chance? It wasn't about pride anymore. It wasn't even about saving Coleman's systems. It was about doing right by someone he had wronged. Richard exhaled slowly. I may not deserve her forgiveness, but I will fight for it, and I will not let her courage be wasted. By the time he left HR, the decision had settled like iron in his bones. He would find Emily Harper. He would tell her the truth, that she had been right all along, that Thomas and Evelyn's betrayal was real, that he had uncovered proof of it. And then, if she was willing, he would ask her to help him, not as a subordinate, not as a secretary, but as a partner in the fight to save what mattered most. Even if she slammed the door in his face, he would at least have spoken the words he should have spoken on the day she was humiliated. Emily Harper was owed that much, and more. Richard tucked the folder under his arm as he walked back to his office. His face was still lined with exhaustion, but his step carried a new weight, a mixture of shame and purpose. The road ahead would be fraught, perhaps impossible, yet he felt a spark of clarity he hadn't felt in years. He could not undo the silence of the past, but he could choose differently tomorrow. And tomorrow, he would begin with Emily. Dorchester was a world away from the glass towers of downtown Boston. The streets were narrower here, lined with modest brick buildings, corner shops with faded awnings, and porches where neighbors waved to one another at dusk. Richard Coleman had never set foot in this neighborhood before. His BMW looked out of place as he parked along the curb and checked the crumpled address written on a slip of paper. Apartment 3B. He climbed the worn staircase, each step groaning under his weight. For a man who had spent decades surrounded by polished marble and soundproof boardrooms, the creak of those steps felt almost accusatory. At last, he reached the door with peeling paint and knocked gently. It was Emily who opened it. Her hair was pulled back in a simple bun, her face pale but resolute. The warmth he had once glimpsed in her eyes was gone, replaced by a guarded coldness. "Mr. Coleman," she said flatly. No title, no deference, only distance. "Emily," he began softly. May I come in?" She hesitated. Behind her, a raspy cough sounded from another room. Emily glanced over her shoulder, then opened the door wider. Inside, the apartment was small but tidy, every corner reflecting care. A stack of medical supplies sat neatly on a side table. On the couch, propped up with pillows, lay an older man with thinning hair and oxygen tubing at his nose. His eyes lit up when he saw Richard. "Emily, you didn't tell me we had a visitor," the man said, his voice weak but cheerful. "Dad, this is Mr. Coleman," Emily said reluctantly. "He's my former employer." The man's smile widened. "The famous Mr. Coleman. I've heard a lot about you. Sit. Richard obeyed, feeling strangely humbled in this modest living room. Emily crossed her arms, standing between him and her father like a sentinel. "What do you want, Mr. Coleman?" Richard cleared his throat. The words he had rehearsed suddenly felt inadequate. "I came to apologize. To you." Her eyebrows lifted, disbelief flickering across her face. "Apologize. After letting Thomas humiliate me in front of 200 people, after you stayed silent while I was dragged out like a thief." Her father shifted uneasily, looking from one to the other. Richard met her eyes, refusing to look away. "You're right," he said simply. "I failed you. You risked everything to warn me, and I abandoned you when you needed me most." That silence, it has haunted me every hour since. Emily's expression hardened. "Haunted you, Mr. Coleman? I lost my job, my reputation. Do you have any idea what that means in my world? One accusation is enough to close every door. I'll never work in law again, not that I was allowed to. Anyway." Her voice trembled, but her anger gave it steel. Richard leaned forward, his tone low and urgent. "I know, and I don't expect forgiveness, but I've uncovered the truth about Thomas, about Evelyn Ross. I found the addendum. Emily, the shell company in the Caymans, their names on it, Emily's arm slowly dropped. For the first time, doubt flickered across her guarded face. "You found proof I did," Richard said. His voice cracked. "And you were right about everything." The room went quiet except for the faint hiss of her father's oxygen machine. Emily sank into a chair, her shoulders tense. "I tried to tell you," she whispered bitterly, "but when it mattered, you chose him over me." Richard swallowed hard. "Because Thomas was my friend of 30 years. Because Evelyn once held my heart. I let my loyalty blind me. That doesn't excuse it, but it is the truth." Emily looked at him with tired eyes. "So, why come here now?" "Out of guilt." Richard hesitated, then shook his head. "Out of responsibility. To you, to this company, to everyone who will be hurt if their scheme succeeds. And yes, out of guilt, I don't want to carry it alone anymore." Her father coughed again, drawing Emily to his side. She adjusted his blanket, brushed his hair back with tender hands. Richard watched, struck by the quiet dignity in her care. He finally understood the note he had read in her file seeking stability and health benefits due to father's long-term illness. "You sacrificed your future for him," Richard said softly. "And still, you risked even that to warn me. That kind of courage is rare. I didn't see it when I should have. I should." Emily didn't answer, but her father looked at her, then back at Richard. His eyes, though tired, gleamed with a kind of hope. "She's always been braver than she knows," he said proudly. Richard took a deep breath. "Emily, I need your help. I can't fight Thomas and Evelyn alone. But with your knowledge, your eye for contracts, your legal mind, we might have a chance. Not just to save the company, but to clear your name, to show the world who you really are." Her eyes filled with anger again, though softer this time. "You had your chance to defend me. Why should I stand beside you now?" "Because the truth deserves to be heard," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "And because I want to make it right. Not as your boss, not as the man who failed you, but as someone who believes in you now, fully, without reservation." The silence stretched. Emily stared at the floor, her jaw tight. Finally, she spoke, her voice low. "You're asking me to risk everything again." "I know," Richard said, "but this time, you won't stand alone." Her father placed a weak hand over hers. "Emily," he whispered, "sometimes life gives us second chances. Maybe this is one." Emily blinked, torn. The room felt heavy with unspoken pain and fragile hope. She finally turned to Richard, her eyes searching his face. "If I agree," she said slowly, "it won't be for you. It will be for the truth and for my father, who deserves to see me cleared." Richard nodded, humbled. "That's all I ask." She exhaled shakily, then gave the smallest nod. "Then we do it in secret. No one can know until we have every piece of proof." A weight lifted from Richard's chest, though the road ahead remained perilous. He leaned forward, voice steady. Then it settled. "We stand together." For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a flicker of hope. Richard had just settled into his office when the door opened without a knock. Thomas Green walked in, his smile tight, followed by Evelyn Ross, immaculately dressed in a slate-gray suit. The sight of them together sent a chill through Richard, though he masked it with practiced calm. "Thomas, Evelyn," he said evenly. "To what do I owe this unannounced visit?" Thomas closed the door with deliberate care. "We thought it best to keep this private," he said smoothly. "Certain matters are sensitive." Evelyn crossed the room and perched on the arm of a chair, her eyes cool and assessing. "Richard, we know." Richard kept his tone neutral. "Know what? That you've been in contact with Emily Harper," she said, her voice like silk laced with steel. His heart skipped, but his face betrayed nothing. "Emily is a former employee. I hardly see the crime in that." Thomas chuckled darkly. "Oh, come on, Richard. Don't insult our intelligence. We know you've met with her more than once, and we know why. Evelyn pulled a folder from her bag and slid it across Richard's desk. Go ahead. Take a look. He opened it, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the documents inside. There were photographs grainy but damning of him entering Emily's Dorchester apartment, of them talking at a cafe, even one of them standing close on the sidewalk. Beside the photos were bank statements. To his horror, they showed a transfer of $200,000 from a Coleman Systems account to a hospital fund under Emily Harper's name. This is fabricated, Richard snapped, though his voice betrayed a flicker of panic. Is it? Evelyn asked, tilting her head. Who do you think the board will believe, you, the CEO accused of fraternizing with a subordinate, or the hard evidence in front of them? Thomas leaned forward, his eyes cold. The story writes itself. Richard, lonely executive, pretty young secretary, money funneled from the company to pay for her sick father's treatments. And in return, she whispers corporate secrets in your ear. A textbook abuse of power. Richard felt his stomach twist. That's a lie, and you both know it. Truth is irrelevant, Thomas said sharply. Perception is everything. Evelyn's voice softened, almost mockingly tender. You've built your career on integrity. Richard, imagine what happens when that reputation is destroyed. Headlines about scandal, investigations, shareholders panicking, Coleman Systems collapsing under the weight of your disgrace. And Emily Richard forced the word through clenched teeth. Evelyn's smile widened. Collateral damage. She'll never work again. Not in law, not in business, not anywhere respectable. She'll be remembered only as the secretary who seduced her boss and brought down a corporation, Thomas added, almost casually. And her father, well, without her insurance, without employment. How long do you think he'll last? You'll have ruined them both. Richard's fists clenched on the desk. His mind screamed against the injustice, but he forced his voice steady. You would destroy an innocent woman's life to get what you want. Thomas's expression was devoid of remorse. This isn't personal. It's strategy. You either sign the contract with Northbridge, or everything we just showed you goes public. Richard stood, anger radiating from him. You're blackmailing me? Thomas met his fury with a shrug. Call it leverage. You've used it yourself in smaller ways. This is just higher stakes. Evelyn rose gracefully, stepping closer. You have one choice. Richard, sign the contract tomorrow morning. Hand over the company. Walk away with your dignity intact. Or resist. And watch Emily Harper and her father be destroyed along with everything you've built. Richard's heart pounded, his chest tight with rage and helplessness. He wanted to shout, to throw them both out of his office, but the folder still lay open on the desk, its fabricated contents a ticking bomb. If the board saw those papers, if the press caught wind of them, it wouldn't matter that they were fake. The stain would never wash away. And Emily, he pictured her father's frail smile, the oxygen tube at his nose. He imagined Emily's proud, wounded eyes as she had agreed reluctantly to join him in exposing the truth. If Thomas and Evelyn carried out their threat, it would be her life shattered, her father's survival at risk. Richard's silence stretched, the weight of it filling the room. Thomas broke it first, his tone smooth and cutting. We've given you until tomorrow, noon. If the contract isn't signed, the evidence goes to the board, the press, and the authorities. And trust me, once it's out there, you won't recover. Evelyn leaned close, her perfume faint but sharp, her words a whisper meant only for him. I told you once, Richard, you think too small. You cling to ideals that will only ever destroy you. Don't make the mistake of dragging her down with you. With that, she straightened, gathering her bag. Thomas followed, opening the door with deliberate calm. We'll expect your signature, he said without looking back. The door closed behind them, leaving Richard alone with the folder. He collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his hands. His mind churned, rage and despair twisting together. For years, he had believed integrity could be his compass. That truth would eventually prevail. But now, truth itself was being weaponized against him, twisted into a blade aimed not at his own heart, but at Emily's. He lifted his head, staring at the photographs spread across his desk. They weren't just lies, they were traps, carefully constructed to isolate him, to make him powerless. He thought of Emily's words the night before. "You're asking me to risk everything again." And he had promised she wouldn't stand alone. Now, with Thomas and Evelyn's ultimatum hanging over him, he wondered if he had just led her into greater danger. The clock on his desk ticked loudly, every second pulling him closer to the deadline. Richard Coleman, once the man who believed friendship and love could never betray him, now sat in his office, trapped in silence, his every option poisoned by the cruelest kind of leverage. For the first time in his career, he truly saw no way out. The night was damp and heavy, Boston's skyline glowing faintly beyond low clouds. Emily Harper stood across the street from Coleman Systems, her heart thundering as she watched the last of the office lights blink out. Security guards made their rounds, their flashlights sweeping the lobby like restless eyes. She pulled her coat tighter around her. This was madness. She no longer worked here. She wasn't supposed to set foot inside. If she was caught, the accusations Thomas had thrown at her would seem like child's play compared to what they'd do now. And yet, she couldn't turn back. Thomas and Evelyn held the power of blackmail over Richard. They would crush him and take the company unless someone found undeniable proof of their scheme. Emily had promised herself she wouldn't risk her father's safety again. But the thought of Richard's face, lined with shame as he admitted his silence, burned in her mind. "If I stay quiet," she whispered to herself, "they'll win. Everything will collapse." She crossed the street. Emily had once known every corner of this building, the service entrances, the forgotten stairwells, the habits of the guards. Years of staying late to tidy up had taught her which alarms were faulty, which cameras had blind spots. Tonight, she relied on that knowledge like a lifeline. She slipped through the loading dock entrance, swiping an old key card she had forgotten to turn in when she was fired. Miraculously, the green light blinked and the lock clicked. The familiar scent of industrial cleaner and faint coffee greeted her as she crept down the narrow hallway. Her shoes barely touched the linoleum. She moved quickly, heart hammering, until she reached the service stairwell. Up 15 flights she climbed, pausing only when her breath threatened to betray her. At last, she reached the executive floor. The corridor stretched silent, the walls lined with framed awards and photographs of Richard and Thomas shaking hands with governors, mayors, even a senator. She forced herself not to look. She had one destination, Thomas Green's office. The door was locked. She expected as much. From her pocket, she pulled a slim hairpin, an old trick she had learned in college while pranking roommates. Her hands shook, but after a tense minute, the lock gave way with a faint click. Inside, the office smelled of leather and cologne. A decanter of scotch sat half empty on the credenza. Papers were neatly stacked on the desk, but Emily ignored them. She was looking for something smaller, something Thomas would never expect her to find. Richard had told her about the threats the way Thomas had spoken so casually of destroying her life, of ruining her father's chances at care. Men like Thomas thrived on control. They recorded everything, certain they'd never be caught. And then she saw it, a polished penholder on the desk, filled with expensive Mont Blancs. One was heavier than the rest. She pulled it out, twisting it apart. Inside, the glint of a micro-recorder greeted her. Emily's breath caught, hands trembling. She slipped it into her pocket. But she wasn't done. She needed to know what was on it. She turned on Thomas's computer, praying he hadn't changed his password. To her astonishment, it was still the same string of numbers he had bragged about once in the break room his college football jersey. The desktop appeared, cluttered with files. Emily searched frantically until she found a folder labeled Audio Archive. She clicked and there it was, dozens of recordings, each time stamped. She selected the most recent. Thomas's voice filled the room, smooth, mocking, laced with cruelty. "We know you've been meeting with her. The board will believe the photographs. Richard, they'll see the bank transfers. Emily Harper will be remembered as the secretary who seduced her boss. And if you resist well, her father won't last long without her insurance. Evelyn's voice chimed in, cold and amused. Sign the contract, Richard, or lose everything. Emily froze, tears stinging her eyes. Hearing it again, word for word, left no doubt. This was the proof they needed. She quickly copied the files onto a flash drive she had brought. The recorder in her pocket was damning enough, but the full archive would destroy Thomas and Evelyn beyond repair. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hall. Emily's blood ran cold. She closed the laptop, plunged the office into darkness, and crouched behind the desk. The door handle rattled. A beam of light cut across the carpet security. Strange, a guard muttered. Thought I heard something? Emily held her breath, every muscle rigid. The guard's flashlight swept the room, inches from her hiding place. Her heart pounded so loud she was sure he could hear it. After what felt like an eternity, the light withdrew. Guess not. Let's move. The door shut. Their footsteps receded down the corridor. Emily slumped against the desk, fighting the urge to sob with relief. She slipped out moments later, moving faster now, down the stairwell, through the service hallway, back to the loading dock. She stepped into the cool night air, clutching the flash drive in her fist like a weapon. On the street, the city seemed different, brighter, sharper. She had faced the danger and survived. But survival wasn't enough. She thought of Richard, trapped in his office, the folder of lies spread before him, blackmailed into silence. She thought of her father, frail and depending on her. She thought of every worker in Coleman Systems who would lose their livelihood if Thomas and Evelyn succeeded. If I keep quiet, she whispered into the night, everything falls apart. I can't let that happen. Not to him. Not to any of us. Her fear was still there, coiled tight in her chest, but over it burned something stronger. Resolve. Emily Harper walked into the darkness, carrying the proof that could bring down giants, and for the first time since her firing, she no longer felt powerless. The boardroom at Coleman Systems had never felt so heavy. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, glinting off polished wood and silver carafes of coffee. But the air inside was thick with anticipation. Around the long mahogany table, board members murmured to one another, papers shuffled, pens clicked nervously. At the far end sat Richard Coleman, his expression unreadable, a folder resting at his fingertips. Thomas Green entered with Evelyn Ross at his side. Both looked impeccably confident. Thomas greeted the board warmly, shaking hands, clapping shoulders. Evelyn glided to her seat, her smile poised, her eyes shining with the cool assurance of victory. To them, this was the day everything would be sealed, the merger with Northbridge, the quiet transfer of assets to Halcyon International, Richard's reluctant signature, a lifetime of loyalty and friendship buried beneath corporate ambition. Thomas leaned toward Richard with a conspiratorial grin. Today we make history, old friend. Richard merely nodded. The chairman called the meeting to order. Gentlemen and ladies, today we finalize the Northbridge merger. This will be the defining moment of Coleman Systems' future. Mr. Coleman, as CEO, do you have any opening remarks? All eyes turned to Richard. For a heartbeat, silence. Then Richard rose, his voice calm but firm. Yes, I do. Before any contracts are signed, there are matters this board must see with their own eyes. Thomas's smile faltered. Richard, this isn't the time for delays. Sit down. Thomas, Richard cut in, his tone sharper than anyone in the room had ever heard. Gasps fluttered around the table. Evelyn arched an eyebrow, but said nothing. Richard gestured toward the door. Please, come in. The door opened. Emily Harper stepped inside. The board members shifted uncomfortably, recognizing her as the secretary who had been publicly dismissed under accusations of theft. Some frowned, others whispered. Thomas sprang to his feet. This is outrageous. She has no place in this meeting. She has every place. Richard said coldly, because the lies told about her have poisoned this company, and today the truth will be heard. Emily walked to the front of the room, her chin lifted despite the storm of eyes upon her. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed a laptop on the table, connecting it to the projector. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady, though her heart raced. "3 weeks ago, I discovered discrepancies in the proposed merger documents. When I raised my concerns, I was accused of theft, humiliated, and terminated, but I could not stay silent. What I bring today is evidence of fraud, of deception, and of betrayal at the highest level of this company." A ripple of tension surged through the board. She clicked to the first slide. On the screen appeared 2 versions of the same contract. "This," Emily said, pointing, "is the version Mr. Coleman was shown. It preserves 60% control of the company post-merger, and this," she advanced the slide, "is the hidden version, the one intended for filing. It strips control down to 25%, transferring 75% of assets to Halcyon International Holdings." Board members leaned forward, murmuring furiously. "Halcyon," Emily continued, "is not Northbridge. It is a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. Its 2 shareholders are Thomas Green and Evelyn Ross." The room erupted. Voices overlapped outrage, disbelief, demands for explanation. Thomas slammed his fist on the table. "Lies. These so-called documents are forgeries, fabrications by a disgruntled employee." Emily cut him off, her voice sharp. "Then perhaps you'd prefer to hear it in your own words." She pressed play. Thomas's voice filled the room, captured with damning clarity. "The board will believe the photographs. Richard, they'll see the bank transfers. Emily Harper will be remembered as the secretary who seduced her boss. And if you resist, well, her father won't last long without her insurance." Gasps broke across the room. One board member dropped his pen. Another muttered, "Good God." Evelyn's voice followed, smooth and cruel. "Sign the contract, Richard, or lose everything." The silence that followed was electric, thick with horror. Thomas's face drained of color. Evelyn sat frozen, her perfect composure cracked for the first time. Richard rose again, his gaze sweeping the board. "You've all heard it. This company was about to be stolen from under us, not by competitors, not by strangers, but by those who claimed to be family. Thomas Green, my friend of 30 years, Evelyn Ross, a woman I once trusted. Together, they plotted not only to rob me, but to rob every shareholder, every employee who has given their life to this company." His voice grew stronger, resonant with conviction. "Emily Harper risked everything to expose this truth. And I," his tone faltered briefly, "raw with regret, I failed to defend her when she spoke out. For that, I take full responsibility. But today, I stand with her, and I ask you to stand with me." The boardroom buzzed with outrage. Some demanded immediate investigation. Others stared at Thomas and Evelyn with undisguised disgust. Those recordings were taken out of context. Thomas shouted, his voice cracking. "You can't possibly enough!" The chairman's gavel cracked against the table. His face was stern, his voice ringing. "This board will not tolerate fraud, deception, or blackmail. An independent audit will begin immediately. Until then, Thomas Green and Evelyn Ross are suspended from all duties, effective immediately." Applause broke out, not the polite kind of corporate courtesy, but genuine, forceful applause. Emily felt her knees weaken with relief. She had done it. Against every odd, she had spoken, and the truth had shattered the lies. Thomas tried to protest, his words drowned by the noise. Evelyn gathered her bag with trembling hands, her mask of control slipping. "You'll regret this," she hissed at Richard as security approached. "No," Richard said quietly. "I regret trusting you," as the guards escorted them out. Richard turned back to the board. "Coleman Systems is more than contracts and numbers. It's built on people. And today, one of those people saved it. Not me, Emily Harper." The room fell silent. then rose in another wave of applause, this time directed at her. Emily's eyes shimmered. For the first time since her humiliation, she felt seen, not as a secretary, not as a scapegoat, but as someone whose courage had changed everything. The boardroom was still buzzing when the doors burst open. Two uniformed officers entered, their footsteps echoing against the polished marble floor. Behind them, a stern-faced detective in a gray suit held a folder thick with warrants. "Thomas Green, Evelyn Ross," the detective announced, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "You are under arrest for corporate fraud, embezzlement, and criminal threats." A gasp swept through the room. Board members shifted in their seats, whispers swelling like waves against the shore. Thomas's face turned a sickly shade of gray. "This is a mistake," he stammered, rising from his chair. "You can't save it for the court," the detective said, signaling the officers forward. The cuffs clicked shut around Thomas's wrists. For a man who had spent 3 decades polishing his reputation as a pillar of the Boston business community, the sight was devastating. His shoulders slumped, his head bowed. For the first time in Richard's memory, his oldest friend looked small. Evelyn tried to maintain her composure, standing tall as the officers approached, but her voice betrayed her, trembling with fury. "Richard, you did this. You set me up. After everything after us, you'd throw me to the wolves." Richard's jaw tightened. He forced himself to meet her gaze. "You threw yourself there. Evelyn, I only chose to stop pretending." The detective read Evelyn her rights as she was handcuffed. She jerked her arm away once, twice, but the steel held fast. Her eyes flashed around the room, desperate for an ally, but found none. When the officers led them both toward the door, the room was silent except for the faint click of cameras. The story of their fall would spread across the city before nightfall. As the doors closed behind the disgraced pair, Richard let out a slow breath, his chest heavy. Relief washed over him, but it carried sorrow with it. Thomas Green had been more than a colleague. He had been a roommate in college, a best man at his wedding, a co-founder of a dream. 30 years of friendship, undone in 30 minutes. And Evelyn once, he had imagined building a future with her, her laughter, her ambition. The way she lit up a room, it had all seemed so real. But behind the glow had been shadows he refused to see. Now, both of them were gone, swept out of his life, in handcuffs. Richard sat slowly, his hands trembling. He felt the weight of victory, but it did not feel like triumph. It felt like burying 2 ghosts he had never wanted to face. The chairman rose, gavel in hand. "Before we adjourn, one matter remains. Miss Emily Harper." All eyes turned to her. Emily stood at the front of the room, shoulders square, though her breath still raced. The chairman's voice softened. "You were accused of theft, humiliated, and dismissed without cause. Today you have restored truth, not only for Mr. Coleman, but for this company. On behalf of the board, I offer our apology and our thanks." Applause broke across the room, not the scattered kind from before, but full, unanimous, and rising. Emily's throat tightened. She had walked into this building weeks ago as a secretary, quiet and unnoticed. She had left in disgrace, shamed by lies, and now she stood vindicated, her name restored before the very people who had judged her. For a moment, she could not speak. Instead, she bowed her head slightly, acknowledging the board, then glanced toward Richard. He was already on his feet, stepping forward. Richard stopped just before her, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I should have defended you that day. I should have trusted you from the start. I failed you." "Emily." Emily looked up, her eyes glistening. "And yet you listened when it mattered most." The silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Richard opened his arms. Emily hesitated only a second before stepping into the embrace. It was not the kind of hug born of romance or obligation. It was heavier than that, an embrace of gratitude, of solidarity, of 2 people who had walked through fire together and come out scarred, but alive, around them. The boardroom fell quiet again. The sight of the weary CEO holding the secretary who had risked everything to save him stirred something deeper than corporate politics. Several board members turned away, blinking hard. One cleared his throat roughly. For those few moments, there was no board, no company, no contracts, just two people bound by truth. When they finally parted, Richard spoke, his voice steadier than it had been in days. "This company owes you everything. I owe you everything. Whatever comes next, we face it together." Emily gave a small, tired smile. "Then let's make sure it's worth facing." Outside, the late afternoon sun dipped low over Boston Harbor, casting long shadows across the glass towers of the city. Police cruisers waited at the curb, their lights flashing red and blue. Reporters shouted questions as Thomas and Evelyn were guided into separate cars, their faces pale and grim under the glare of cameras. The giants had fallen. Inside, Coleman's systems stood shaken but unbroken. The storm had passed, leaving wreckage behind, but also clearing the air. And at its center stood Richard and Emily, two unlikely allies bound not by ambition, but by courage. For Richard, the betrayal of his oldest friend and his first great love would leave scars. But as he looked at Emily, he knew he had gained something rarer, the chance to rebuild on the foundation of truth. The boardroom had emptied hours ago, but Richard Coleman still lingered in his office, staring at the Boston skyline as twilight settled over the harbor. The chaos of the day had finally quieted, yet one thought pressed at him relentlessly: Emily Harper. She had risked everything to save him. She had stood tall when the weight of false accusations tried to bury her. And now, with Thomas and Evelyn in custody, Richard knew the company's survival and perhaps his own sanity owed itself to her courage. There was only one thing left to do. The next morning, Richard drove across the city to a modest brick apartment building in Dorchester. It was far from the polished neighborhoods he usually visited, but he had memorized the address from the HR file. His heart thudded as he climbed the narrow staircase and stopped outside apartment 3B. He knocked gently. The door opened a crack, and Emily stood there, her expression wary. She was dressed simply, dark sweater, hair pulled back, no trace of the polished corporate image. Her eyes searched his, cautious but not cold. "Mr. Coleman," she said quietly. "What are you doing here, Richard?" he corrected softly. "Please, just Richard." She didn't respond, only waited. "I came to ask you something," he continued, his voice steady though his palms felt damp. "I want you to come back, not as a secretary, not as support staff, as vice president of legal affairs." Her breath caught, but her expression hardened. "That's absurd." "No, it isn't. You saw what no one else did. You understood the legal traps, the hidden clauses. You have the mind, the skill, the integrity this company needs." Emily shook her head, her hand tightening on the door. "You don't understand. I was humiliated in front of everyone, dragged out like a criminal. Even if the board apologized, even if the truth is out, do you think I can walk back into that building and pretend none of it happened?" Richard swallowed. "No, I don't. And I wouldn't ask you to pretend. I'd ask you to come back and rewrite what that building stands for, to be more than what they assumed of you, to help me rebuild not just the company, but the trust we both lost." Emily's lips pressed into a thin line. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. "Finally," she whispered. "I need time." "Take all you need," Richard said, his voice quiet but firm. "But know this, you belong at the table, Emily, and I'll keep that chair open for you." That evening, Emily sat in the small living room with her father, who was settled in his recliner. His breathing was shallow, but his eyes were alert, full of the quiet wisdom that came from years of hardship. She told him everything Richard's offer, her doubts, her humiliation, her fear of walking back into the spotlight. When she finished, her father chuckled softly, though it turned into a brief cough. "Emily, when you were 12, you won that debate tournament at school. Remember?" She smiled faintly. "Yes. You made me practice my closing statement 100 times." And you won because you didn't let fear stop you from standing up in front of all those people. His voice softened. Fear didn't stop you then. Why should it stop you now? She looked down at her hands. It's not just fear. It's pride. I don't want them to think I'm coming back begging. Her father reached over, resting his frail hand on hers. You're not begging. You're being recognized. You deserve this. You've always deserved more than life gave you. Maybe now, finally, the world is catching up. Emily blinked back tears. But what if I fail? Then fail with honor. But don't fail by staying silent when you have a chance to speak. Her father's words lingered in her heart long after he fell asleep. 2 days later, Emily walked into Coleman Systems again. Heads turned, whispers followed her through the glass atrium, but she kept her head high. Richard was waiting by the elevator. When their eyes met, he gave a small, steady nod, not the commanding gesture of a CEO, but the quiet reassurance of someone asking for trust. Together, they rode up to the executive floor. In the boardroom, Richard formally introduced her. This is Emily Harper, our new Vice President of Legal Affairs. The room filled with polite applause. Emily's heart pounded, but she stood straight, her voice clear as she replied, "Thank you. I'm ready to get to work." For the first time in weeks, she felt the ground firm beneath her feet. That evening, Richard walked her to the parking lot. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of the harbor. "You were brilliant today," he said softly. Emily gave a wry smile. "I didn't say much. Sometimes presence says more than words." Richard replied. "And you were exactly where you were meant to be." She looked at him then. Really looked. The lines of exhaustion were still etched around his eyes, but beneath them was something steadier, something she hadn't noticed before. A kind of vulnerability that made him seem less like the untouchable CEO and more like a man trying to rebuild what he'd broken. "Richard," she said gently, "you don't need to keep proving yourself to me." "Maybe not," he admitted, "but I need to prove something to myself that I can still choose integrity, even when it's hard, and that starts with trusting the right people." The moment stretched between them. It wasn't charged with grand gestures or unspoken promises, just quiet recognition. Emily's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Then, let's see if we can trust each other." Richard nodded, one step at a time. As they stood there under the fading light, something unspoken passed between them. Not yet love, not yet certainty, but the fragile beginning of both. A year can change everything. Coleman Systems, once trembling on the edge of collapse, now stood stronger than it had in decades. Its glass tower gleamed above Boston Harbor, like a lighthouse no longer a symbol of secrecy and power plays, but of something rarer in corporate America: integrity. Richard Coleman had reshaped the company's philosophy around 3 simple words: honesty, transparency, humanity. Investors had been wary at first, but clients responded with surprising loyalty. Employees, inspired by the new culture, worked with a pride that no quarterly bonus could ever buy. Revenues soared, but more importantly, trust flourished. And at the center of it all was Emily Harper, no longer the quiet secretary who shuffled papers in the corner. She now sat at Richard's right hand as Vice President of Legal Affairs. Her sharp mind and steady courage guided every major decision. In meetings, when others hesitated, she spoke with clarity. When tensions rose, her calm presence anchored the room. Employees whispered that she was the company's compass. Richard quietly agreed. At home, life had changed as well. Emily's father, once frail and clinging to life, had undergone successful surgery the previous spring. Insurance this time, secured through the company's revised healthcare plan, covered what once seemed impossible. On weekends, he walked slowly through the neighborhood park, cane in hand, breathing deeply of air he once feared he'd never taste again. "You did this, Emily," he told her often, his voice filled with pride. She always shook her head. "No, Dad, we did this. You taught me not to give up." Still, she carried his words like a quiet blessing. Richard, too, had changed. The haunted look that once shadowed his face had softened. The betrayal of Thomas and Evelyn still lingered in memory, but no longer as a wound now, as a lesson carved deep into his soul. He had learned that power without principle was empty, that friendship without trust was fragile, that money could vanish, but character endured, and slowly. Something else had grown between him and Emily. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't declared with fireworks or grand gestures. It was built in late nights spent drafting policies, in mornings sharing coffee before meetings, in the way they spoke freely, sometimes without words at all, one step at a time, as they had promised. That autumn, Richard invited Emily and her father for a weekend at Cape Cod. The air was crisp, the ocean restless beneath a wide New England sky. On the second evening, as the sun bled gold across the horizon, Richard asked Emily to walk with him along the shore. The sand was cool beneath their shoes, gulls wheeling overhead. For a while they spoke of ordinary things, the company's next initiative, her father's steady recovery, the stubborn Red Sox season. But as the waves lapped at the shore, Richard's tone shifted. "Emily," he said softly, pausing to face her. She turned, the wind tugging strands of hair across her cheek. "Yes." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small box, the kind that made her breath catch. "For years, I thought legacy meant numbers, profits, expansions, towers with my name on them. But after everything we lived through, I've learned something different." His voice trembled, though his gaze held steady. "Legacy is not what we build for ourselves. It's what we build with others, and I can't imagine building the future without you." He opened the box. Inside lay a simple diamond ring, elegant but understated, gleaming in the fading light. Emily's eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth. "Richard!" He went down on one knee in the sand, his suit pants catching grains of salt and sea. But he didn't care. "Emily Harper! You saved me when I was too blind to see. You reminded me what courage looks like. You taught me that the truth, no matter how costly, is the only foundation worth standing on. Will you marry me?" For a moment the world seemed still only the sound of waves, the cry of distant gulls, the pounding of her heart. Tears blurred her vision, but her smile broke through. "Yes. Richard, yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, his hands trembling, then rose as she threw her arms around him. The kiss they shared was tender, carrying the weight of all they had endured and the promise of all they would build. On the cliff above, her father watched from a bench, tears shining in his eyes. For the first time in years, they were tears of joy. As twilight deepened, Richard and Emily stood side by side, looking out at the endless horizon. The ocean stretched vast before them, uncertain but full of promise, like the future they were about to step into. Richard's arm wrapped gently around her shoulders. Emily leaned into him, the diamond catching the last rays of the sun. "Money and power," Richard murmured, almost to himself, "can be stolen in an instant." But honesty and courage, Emily finished for him, her voice soft but firm. "Those can never be taken." They stood in silence after that, letting the truth settle between them like the tide against the shore. And in that silence, a legacy was born, not of wealth, not of towers, but of integrity, love, and the kind of courage that could outlast betrayal. Their story, once marked by whispers and shadows, had found its true ending in the open light of day, or perhaps its true beginning. Life has a way of testing us when we least expect it. Richard Coleman thought success meant power, money, and loyal partners. But in the darkest hour, he discovered that wealth can vanish, friendships can betray, and even love can turn into a weapon. What endures is something far more precious: honesty, courage, and the willingness to stand up for what is right, even when the cost is high. Emily Harper, a woman overlooked by nearly everyone, reminded us that integrity does not depend on status or title. Sometimes, the bravest truth comes from the quietest voice. And sometimes, the real strength of a leader is not in making the easy choice, but in facing the painful truth. For all of us, whether in business, in family, or in everyday life, The lesson is clear. Guard your integrity. Listen to those who dare to speak the truth. And remember, money and power may fade, but the legacy of courage and honesty will outlast us all. Because in the end, what defines us is not what we own, but the principles we refuse to abandon. Thank you so much for staying with us through this story. We truly hope it touched your heart and gave you something meaningful to think about. If you enjoyed today's story, please remember to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Shining Stories. Your support helps us continue bringing you inspiring tales of courage, honesty, and hope. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss our next story. Until then, take care and keep shining.